What happened yesterday? Walk me through your day, Jay. Yesterday.
Well, I got to the Greensboro Coliseum at 8:30 in the morning, and I was a guest on the Packer and Durham show on the ACC network, and was asked immediately what should happen and what will happen with the ACC tournament. And I said that there's no way that the ACC can play games. The tournament should be canceled. And it's a responsibility that not only the ACC has, but all the member institutions to be essentially responsible global citizens in the face of a pandemic. And you can't bring all these people together and then send them back out and risk spreading the virus, given what the World Health Organization had said the day before. And as you said, this is changing. The Commissioner, John Swofford, was the next guest on Packer and Durham and said, we're playing, and the games are going forward. I knew that there was going to be discussion afterwards, because that couldn't have been the final word. Swofford and other Power 5 commissioners were on a call at 10 o'clock Eastern time and discussed what their options were and what their action should be. And around about that time, I got some phone calls from ACC coaches. One in particular that said, we are not coming to the game. And the university president at Duke University, Vincent Price, basically shut down Duke Athletics and said Duke Athletics is suspending play in order to be that, what I would call, responsible global citizen, and to have social distancing and the like. But I was standing on the court ready for the 12:30 game between Florida State and Clemson to take place when Florida State ran out onto the court. Its band started playing, and I happened to be on the air live at the time with, I think, SportsCenter, and just said, this doesn't feel right. There's a tone deafness in this building that is not right. And it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes later that Florida State was off the floor. John Swofford came onto the floor and canceled the tournament and handed Florida State the automatic bid. It was just a surreal process, and one that had sadness to it, but there was an inevitability to it that you knew the right thing has to be done here, and when is somebody going to step forward and do it? And finally, the ACC did it.
Oh, man. So when you said there was just a feeling of this is just not right, who shared that with you, Jay?
Everybody. I mean, I don't know anybody that didn't. I was on press row with my colleagues, some of whom were from ESPN, some from other outlets, and we were looking at one another saying, what are we doing? I mean, we can't get ready to do a game here. It just felt inappropriate, with the backdrop being the NBA has canceled play. And the first, I know a lot of people are pointing toward Rudy Gobert testing positive on Wednesday. But for me, the biggest event was the World Health Organization declaring this a global pandemic. And this was nothing to mess around with. And the Ivy League, Rich, was ahead of everyone on this. You know, they canceled their tournament the week before and canceled play. So they were sort of leading the way in this and saying this is serious. And even before that, in Austin, Texas, there's an event called South by Southwest that canceled the event. That's a $350 million event. As far as the impact that it has in bringing people from around the country and around the world, and then the money that is in and around Austin during that time period. So it's not like this was operating in a vacuum and this just, you snapped your fingers and it just happened at once. This was building in a lot of ways, and maybe we could argue that we all should have been more aware that this should have happened earlier or should have been considered earlier. But it just seemed like, wait a minute, this has to stop, and then the NCAA has to act faster. Like we heard what I thought was really important and principled leadership from Mark Cuban the night before, when he was, I thought, very reassuring in stepping behind a microphone and explaining what was going on with his franchise, with the NBA, mentioning the hourly workers that would be affected by it, but we hadn't heard word one out of Indianapolis. And when on Wednesday, when the NCAA announced that they were going to go forward with the tournament but with no spectators, I thought that was an appropriate step to take, because you don't cancel first, you can always cancel later. but I was struck by the fact that Mark Emmert said, "I made this decision," and then I was struck by sort of I don't know what you'd call it, the structural leadership failures in the NCAA of, there was no communication with the commissioners. And so the commissioners found out that news same time you and I did. And so in the backdrop of the NCAA saying no spectators, the governing body saying no spectators at our event, the Big Ten, the ACC, all these other conferences are playing games with spectators. And it made everybody look silly and uninformed. And I can tell you that the commissioners were really upset about that, really upset. And ultimately, the NCAA, and you give Mark Emmert credit and Danny Gavitt credit and the leadership team credit, but you also give for ultimately doing the right thing. They did the right thing by canceling the tournament, and they got where they needed to be. But I will tell you, I think that an incredible amount of credit should go to the independent directors on the Board of Governors that came onto the Board of Governors as a result of the Rice Commission recommendations. And were it not for those independent directors pushing Mark Emmert to act swiftly, I'm not sure that we would have gotten to where we should have been as quickly as we should have gotten there. They deserve a ton of credit for helping to guide this to be in the right spot.
Did you say essentially that the ACC, based on whatever was going on yesterday in conference calls and lack of communication from Indianapolis to conference presidents and executive directors, that Duke acted before the ACC to basically say, we're not doing this? And obviously that would force the hand. If Duke's saying, I'm not taking part in an ACC tournament or an NCAA tournament, then what are we doing it for? Is that the timeline? And if so, how did Coach K play in all this, best to your knowledge, Jay?
That's exactly what happened. Is the determination was made by the president of Duke University, Vincent Price, that Duke would suspend all athletic activities, and not just for basketball, but for all of athletics. And it was done, according to President Price, in order for social distancing and to make sure that they didn't contribute to the spread of the virus. I was told, I can't remember the exact time, whether it was 10:30, 11 o'clock, that neither NC State, I was told by one of the coaches, neither NC State nor Duke, who were scheduled to play in the 2:30 game, the second game of the quarterfinals, neither were coming to the game. So essentially they were saying, look, we're not going to come and play. And look, there's discussion out there now that every player wants to play. And in the abstract, that's true. They want to play. Everybody would want to play, but they want to play under the right conditions. And some of the players were apprehensive. Some of the state players, some of the Duke players were apprehensive about what about their families? What's going on? This doesn't feel right. Things like that. Not that they didn't want to play, but they were concerned. And I was told, I talked with Mike Krzyzewski, and he told me, I'm looking at a different team today than I looked at yesterday. And the players were making what I consider to be very mature observations about what they were facing and what the league was facing and whether this felt right and was right. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't want to play, so to speak. But it was young men, and that's another thing, Rich, where we keep saying, well, these kids, infantilizing them. The NCAA calls this men's basketball and women's basketball. These are adults. They're young people, but they're adults, and they're smart. And they were asking a lot of smart questions, and they were wondering what their place in this was and whether this was the right thing. And they weren't the only ones. There were others that were doing it, but I'm not sure that should be overlooked.